Hi there, my name is Hannah Todorovich, and my presentation will be on slavery and the slave trade for my Human Rights in the Romantic Era project. Let's begin. Throughout the 18th century, slavery and the slave trade was one of the most important human rights issues of the Romantic period. What are human rights, you may ask? Human rights are rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, or any other status. These rights include the right to life, liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, the right to work, and many more. Human rights laws weren't adopted by the General Assembly and United Nations until 1948, much later than I thought before looking this up. This declaration has been described as the UN's most greatest achievement. In this era, many people moved towards an anti-slavery society by expressing their objection to slavery through art, literature, poetry, philosophy, and much more. And this kind of reminds me of our social media today, where people in the Romantic period were getting their information and forming their opinions based off of what they were seeing in art, literature, poetry, etc. By the 18th century, the slave trade was extremely organized and very economically successful. America, Africa, and Europe could trade goods at a much faster rate, and the revenue that was being made from slaves doing all of the work without any of the pay was an economic miracle. In the Romantic period, abolitionist campaigns began, which influenced a political shift in British and European culture. There were many poets who objected slavery, but I'll be talking about two today, and their most famous works which you've read in class. The first poet I'd like to discuss is William Cooper. William Cooper struggled with a mental breakdown in the early years of his life, and he even tried to kill himself at one point. After he recovered from this attempt, he finds passion in learning more about people deemed outcasts of society. Cooper was a proud supporter of the abolition of slavery, and he even had a good friend who was an abolitionist. So William was happy to write 4 poems in support of this friend's cause. The Negro's Complaint, which is the poem I'm going to be discussing next, was one of these poems. The Negro's Complaint was a poem written in the perspective of a slave. Cooper wrote this poem to show what is happening in the background of slavery, so to speak, since slaves were unable to object against the abuse themselves for fear of worse retaliation. The poem is geared towards a white audience who are also against slavery. It's said that he actually wrote this poem for his abolitionist friends, but I think if you were to release this poem to maybe groups of people who were in support of slavery, it might help change their opinions and also make them against slavery. This poem is very graphic and it is very sad. The next poet I'll be discussing is Hannah More. Hannah More supported the abolition of slavery with her poems. She wrote many poems throughout her life about the abolition of slavery and slavery itself, but one of her most famous poems, which was written in 1795, called From the Sorrows of Yamba, is the poem I will be discussing today. And a little fun fact about Hannah More is she continued to support the cause of abolition, like I said, throughout her entire life, and she even lived long enough to see the abolition of slavery in the British Empire before she died. Moving on to the poem itself. From the Sorrows of Yamba, otherwise known as the Negro Woman's Lamentation, it's also written in the perspective of a slave. However, this is written in the perspective of a woman named Yamba, who is kidnapped from her homeland in Africa and shipped to Britain as a slave. She also discusses the brutality and horrors of being a slave, but also shines a light on Christianity and slavery. In the poem, Yamba was actually converted to Christianity, and this begs the controversial question: how can you be a Christian and support slavery? This question sparked a lot of, like I said, controversy because a lot of people were Christians back then, and this poem definitely made people take a good hard look at their morals. So you must be wondering, slavery has been abolished for years now. These poems are old news. What makes them still popular to this day? Well, you're wrong. These poems are not old news. They are still popular today for good reason. Not only are they relevant because they tie back to world history, but also because of the human rights violations that are still occurring today, such as incarceration, as well as the issues of immigrant and migrant workers, which I'll touch on in a little more detail. As far as the incarceration issue, Black men and Black women are incarcerated at a much higher rate than white people. They are also given longer sentences for small and petty crimes in comparison to the white criminals, and even the way media portrays Black criminals versus white criminals is very discriminatory. And a little fact here, African Americans are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of whites. So instead of being written from the perspective of a slave, both the Negro's Complaint and From the Sorrows of Yamba could be rewritten in the voice of a prisoner in the US criminal justice system. Both of these poems discuss the brutality that these slaves faced, the discrimination, and the sadness that they felt on a daily basis. The next issue is using the cheap labor from immigrants, especially Latina immigrants, for agriculture here in the United States. This is a form of slavery. Even though these people are being paid, they're being paid very little, barely enough to support themselves and their families. These poems could speak from the point of view from an immigrant farmer or even a child laborer, where yes, child labor is still occurring in the United States. This is very economically profitable for the United States, considering they only need to pay these workers less than minimum wage, and these workers work very hard day in and day out. On the next slide, I've shared a link of 2 sisters who are migrant workers who are working to get themselves through school and also to send money back to their family in Mexico.
Along the U.S.-Mexico border, in this sleepy farming community, Jimena and Leslie Aguilar have little time to rest.
I want to be a surgeon.
Surgeon? And what do you want to be when you grow up?
A pediatrician.
But at just 17 and 15 years old, they're not able to only focus on school. In collaboration with my colleague Nicole Suarez from Noticias Telemundo, we followed their daily struggle.
So you're the head of the family now.
Yeah.
What does that feel like?
Well, it feels normal, but at the same time, it's a big responsibility.
When their parents were deported to Mexico 2 years ago, the girls, both U.S. citizens, stayed behind. Now, the sisters attend school in person just 1 day a week and work full-time in these agricultural fields.
Tell me a little bit about what it's like to go out there day after day.
Well, it's really hot sometimes. I wanted just to leave everything there and leave, but I was like, no. I kept going.
Would it be easier for you to move back to Mexico with your parents?
We have to stay here so that my brothers can get education.
Do you think you're growing up too fast?
Yes.
As night falls, their day begins.
Jimena, what time did you get here?
I got here around 10:30.
10:30 at night.
Yes.
It's now almost 5 o'clock in the morning.
Yes.
Why have you been here so long?
We went looking for a job. I have to go ask bus by bus, van by van till I get one.
Because they're in between crop seasons in Arizona, the jobs are scarce. But Jimena gets lucky. She's headed to a melon field where she'll work for the day. Not Leslie.
So your sister Jimena just left on a bus. Now you're by yourself. Does that scare you?
Yes, because I don't know where she is going. I don't know who the people are. Where are they taking her?
The Aguilar sisters are only 2 of the estimated 400,000 to 500,000 migratory and seasonal child laborers in the United States. Agriculture is big business in Arizona, bringing in roughly $23 billion a year. But for these essential workers, it's barely enough to pay the bills. The Aguilar sisters work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week in the field to support their family.
The work is grueling, and each of them earn about $500 a week.
Feel free to watch the rest of that video. I've provided the link in my works cited. But I think that these poems could also be written from the point of view of these two sisters and the struggle that they face in supporting themselves and their families.
Along the U.
And this brings me to the end of my presentation about the Romantic era, human rights violation, and even a little tidbit and insight on how these are still occurring today. Thanks for watching.